We now have overwhelming evidence that at least 5 major governments colluded in manipulating the oil price down in the last 2 weeks. So US WTI oil prices at the beginning of last week were around $80 a barrel. Aaron Basil, who does This Week in Charts on my YouTube channel once a week, he was talking about how oil was potentially about to break out. And then you started to see all these news articles from the Biden administration and from the US government about how they were negotiating with China. They were negotiating with other governments. And then you started to see these news articles come out almost daily, and you're still seeing news articles come out about how the US may still release even more millions of barrels in their strategic petroleum reserve. But we have, with these articles that have come out just in the last 10 or so days, we have China, which did not release a lot, but just all these governments colluding together, all these major governments colluding together. And this is not hidden manipulation. This is not covert. This is blatant and overt directly. They're not even trying to hide it. Market manipulation. So we have at least 5 major governments, and this does not count OPEC, which is the Organized Petroleum Exporting Cartel. And they're obviously a cartel, so they're used to manipulating or trying to manipulate the oil market in different ways, up or down. They prefer a Goldilocks oil price, but the blatant attempt here was to prevent the oil price from breaking out above $80 a barrel, as it was going to probably early last week. And now you have the oil price, which has gone from $80 a barrel WTI early last week down to $66 a barrel today on Tuesday, November 30th. That is around an 18% drop in under 2 weeks, because you have India, China, Japan, South Korea, the United States, all colluding to try to manipulate the oil price to release strategic petroleum reserves. Now, what will probably happen is China will end up just buying the oil back at a cheaper price, but this is going to hurt a lot of private oil companies that were thinking about bringing new supply online. There are big problems in the long term of replacing oil reserves, of oil companies, both governmental national oil companies and private sector oil companies, making enormous amounts of investments into replacing oil supply and oil reserves. However, I think that uranium for nuclear power and natural gas for LNG, liquefied natural gas, have a far more stable and brighter long-term bull market than coal and oil, because for baseload electricity generation, natural gas and uranium for nuclear power are really the only 2 major forms of fuel that can reliably handle baseload electricity generation. For wind and solar, there's enormous amounts of problems. There's actually a lot of problems. They're nowhere near as economic if the wind's not blowing, if the sun's not shining in certain areas. Like, for example, solar doesn't work up in northern countries like Germany for most of the year. There's a lot of examples like this of where wind and solar do not work. They are intermittent compared to nuclear power and natural gas power. So patrons for the last 18 to 24 months with articles behind the paywall have been told, and I was reading annual reports from oil and natural gas companies about how demand for natural gas would be a lot more stable than demand for these other sources of energy. But there is now a lot of proof that at least 5 major governments have colluded the last 10 to 14 days to manipulate the oil price down, to smash it down. And this is going to cause a lot of damage. I think there's political reasons for this based on polling, that the Biden administration is trying to help themselves with upcoming congressional elections, because here in the US, the higher the gasoline prices, normally the incumbent party gets blamed. In Congress, the incumbent party in the White House. But it is very interesting that Biden begged Xi for help, dictator Xi for help, considering that there's a lot of evidence that Biden has been on the Chinese Communist Party payroll since before he was vice president in the Obama administration. But I think China is going to stockpile even more oil on this dip. So I don't think China really sold a lot of their oil, and this is going to benefit China, who's going to accumulate more oil on this dip. But I think that uranium's bull market for nuclear power, and also natural gas and LNG, and I was predicting this 18 to 20 months ago, that natural gas and LNG would have a better, more clear bull market based on demand than oil. Finally, if you like content like this and want to help keep content like this free so it doesn't all end up behind a paywall, or you want far more in-depth content research, financial education, and analysis than I provide in these short little free videos, there are now over 190 articles and audio podcasts behind the paywall, exclusive for patrons, all for the cost of a Starbucks cup of coffee per month, only $5 a month. I think it is one of the best deals out there. And just in the last 22 or so weeks, there are 34 new articles and audio podcasts out, including 3 new long audio podcasts out in the last 10 to 14 days for patrons about the uranium market, a Q3 update on gold miners. The gold miners are not doing well with these rapidly rising energy costs and other costs. Their costs are rising. Meanwhile, the royalty and streaming companies don't have to worry about that. So those are the companies that are actually going to benefit if gold and silver prices do go sideways for a little bit longer. You'll see even more deals done from Franco-Nevada, Wheaton Precious Metals, Royal Gold, Osisko Gold Royalty, Sandstorm Gold. They'll just keep growing. And that's why royalty and streaming companies like Franco-Nevada since 2009, despite the paper gold and silver prices not doing very much, Franco-Nevada's share price is up around 7x with dividend increases every year for over a decade. And Sandstorm Gold is just starting to hit its J-curve growth pattern, very similar to Franco-Nevada. I will hopefully in the next week or so get out an update on the Hot Mountain feasibility study and the environmental permits. I'll talk about that in an audio podcast as well for patrons. And there's also an audio podcast on rising geopolitical risk in South America and Mexico, which is hurting a lot of primary silver miners in Mexico. You've seen over the last 6 to 8 years, pretty much every single primary silver miner start to buy gold mines, and the last remaining holdouts earlier this year all bought gold mines outside of Mexico. So if I could wrap up this short little video very quickly, we now have overwhelming evidence that at least 5 major governments, so this is the US, China, India, Japan, and South Korea, colluded and overtly attempted, and they have successfully attempted, at least so far, to manipulate the oil market lower. The price of WTI oil went from $80 at the beginning of last week down to $66 today. That is around a 20% drop, almost a bear market. Trader Aaron Basil, who does my show This Week in Charts, was talking about how the oil market at the beginning of last week was very close to a breakout, upside breakout to 90 and a new bull market. The manipulation of releasing strategic petroleum reserves and issuing press releases about releasing them, the U.S. is still issuing press releases about releasing oil reserves, has knocked the oil price down considerably. This is just a short-term problem. In the long term, there are big oil supply problems, especially if demand starts to come back. However, I think that natural gas and uranium have a more stable and brighter long-term future for a bull market, especially for electricity generation, because they both are the most stable and best for baseload electricity generation, far more stable and more reliable than wind and solar. And this is exactly what I mean by governments and central banks, politicians and bureaucrats and regulators moving the goalposts and changing the rules. This was a blatant rules change, a blatant intervention, blatant market manipulation. And I'm using air quotes here because these are not markets then. If you have governments issuing press releases almost daily, major governments, not a tiny little government, these are large governments, issuing press releases threatening to release more oil to manipulate the price down. But this is hurting oil supply in the long term. This is hurting oil companies in the long term. But governments, politicians, and bureaucrats and central bankers and regulators don't care about that. There are so many bad policy decisions with central bankers and also with energy policy. The energy policy that has been done in the Western world post-Fukushima for nuclear power is absolutely horrible. Nuclear power plants were shut down. Uranium mine supply was taken offline, and it's almost impossible to get a single nuclear power plant built here in countries like the United States, when we really need as many reliable sources of electricity generation as possible. The policy mistakes by politicians, bureaucrats, and regulators for nuclear power post-Fukushima all over the globe is absolutely horrendous.